a series of rolling strikes that caught employers by surprise. You didn't know where UAW was going to strike next, and we saw a lot of enthusiasm and excitement around that.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Sarah Lazaire is the editor for Workday magazine. She was the former editor, former web editor for In These Times magazine, and has been a guest now 2 or 3 times on the Valley Labor Report.
The biggest distinction,
the biggest distinction, obviously. I mean, that's going to be the first thing she lists on her CV, I'm sure, if she ever tries to get into a different job. Sarah, welcome back to the program. Appreciate the time. Yep. And so your latest piece or actually, I don't know, you may have published something in between when you published this piece a couple of weeks ago and now, but you published a piece about the UAW's attempt to get Stellantis to reopen the Belvidere assembly plant. And this is this is just before they were able to get it into the contract that they negotiated with Stellantis. And so now your article is focusing on how are they going to make sure that this happens, that it's not just words on a page, that Stellantis actually follows through. But before we get to that, can you just talk to us about the significance of reopening an indefinitely idled plant?
It's pretty incredible. And, when I asked labor scholar Barry Eadling if it was unprecedented, he said it's at least unprecedented for over many decades. I heard about the Belvidere assembly plant closing a lot during the UAW stand-up strike. I went down to a practice ticket at the Chicago assembly plant, which is a Ford facility. And when people talked about Belvidere plant shutting down, it really became a symbol of corporate greed and callousness and willingness to just walk away from communities that have been giving, in this case, Stellantis profits for many, many decades. So the idea then that as a result of the strike, the plant would reopen was just stunning. When I heard that, I was like, wow, that is huge news for this town of 25,000 that's been really devastated by the closure. Grocery stores near the plant have already closed. Restaurants have gone out of business. There are a lot of workers there who have kids in the local school system who may have relocated for those jobs or who have been in the community for a long time, and they were looking at the real possibility of being uprooted, and then all of a sudden they're not anymore, or at least hopefully they're not anymore. And, one thing that really interested me about this story is that a common anti-union trope says that you better not unionize your plant because it'll get shut down. And this cuts against that. And this says, actually, a strike succeeded in reopening an idled plant, which is almost unheard of.
Right. And I have been, I've been using that a lot. One of the stations that we're on is a conservative radio station, and so I go on weekly on the morning radio hosts program, and that's something that he's constant. Anytime the UAW comes up, he's like, "Isn't that going to make it?" The reason that Alabama has gotten all of these auto jobs is because of, right to work, no unions and stuff. So isn't there a risk that all of these auto jobs are going to leave if the UAW comes in, right? Third partying the union comes in as opposed to, the workers here organizing with the UAW. And so that has been actually incredibly beneficial for for me as I'm going on the radio trying to make the case for this, because obviously, we know that it doesn't have to be that way, but it has been that way for decades. And so the fact that they were actually able to materially reverse this for the first time, like you said, that Eidlin said, in at least decades, is huge, and is huge for, and I think will be huge for their campaign to organize the non-union sector.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what a talking point. when you're speaking with skeptical workers or workers who may not be familiar with unions, what an anecdote to be able to share. I do want to say that when I got to Belvidere to report this story, the tone I was met with from workers was one of excitement and optimism, but tempered with caution and sometimes outright uneasiness. There was a strong awareness that there's a difference between winning something on paper in a contract and actually making it happen. And I did hear complaints from some workers in Belvidere who said that the company has not been as forthright as they would have liked in terms of transparency around when all the workers are going to come back, what exactly is the timetable, when exactly can we expect X number of jobs. At the time, around 165 workers had been called back to sort of do parts distribution work. The local president, Matt Franson, said that number was 180. The company said it was 165. But one of the workers that I profiled still hadn't at the time been called back yet. I haven't checked in with him. There's a chance that by now he has. But he was very eager to get back to work and just sort of, I think people have reason to be hopeful and reason to be optimistic, but are also very, very cautious. And I do want to point out that there are a few provisions that are cause for optimism. So one is that the new Stellantis contract achieved through the stand-up strike, it does say that workers have the right to strike over plant closures and product and things like that, which means that if the company were to not follow through on its commitments laid out in the contract, that it could potentially have a strike on its hands, and workers are allowed to strike the entire company over those things. So that's one thing that bodes well. Another thing that bodes well is that the company, at least right now, is on the hook to pay subpay to a certain amount of workers, equaling 74% of their former pay at 40 hours a week. So, it's a good sign that the company is still tethered to at least some of those workers. And then I just want to point out the commitments laid out in the contract. It's not just a reversal of the idling of the Belvidere assembly plant. They've also committed to relocating an electric vehicle facility in Belvidere, and then also a big parts distribution hub. I will say that the parts distribution hub is going to consolidate potentially other nearby hubs. So it is possible that people in other communities may lose their positions or look at having to transfer. And that was one thing that workers pointed out as well. So this is all to say that, this is not perfect. What's ever perfect? Right. And also, it's not really a done deal. Matt Franson, the president of the local, told me, we are so excited, but we'll believe it when we start seeing the dirt being moved and the concrete being poured. And I think that really sums up the tone that I was met with when I went to Belvidere.
The thing that in your article that gave me the most optimism was Stellantis being on the hook for that subpay of 74% of their wages. How is it that, what are the qualifications for that?
So my understanding, I took a note on these numbers because I didn't want to be inaccurate. So at the time I reported this, the local president told me that 815 members of the local are receiving subpay. And are expected to get placed into jobs eventually, on top of what he said were 180 who are currently back to work in parts distribution. However, that is less than the total number of people who were put out of work. So when the company, idled in February 2023, this put 1,350 workers out of work. but the actual number who have been put out of work since cuts first began is much, much greater. And a lot of those workers have transferred, have moved on. So subpay isn't necessarily going to every single worker impacted, but it is a big chunk of the local.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
No, so is the criteria something like, you know, you haven't transferred, and that makes sense that you're not gonna give subpay to somebody who's working for your company in another location. You know, that, I mean, they have their full pay. That, you know, that makes some amount of sense. Or maybe they have permanently moved on and they don't have intentions of returning. But if people are still in Belvidere, they haven't gotten another permanent occupation, then they get subpay. Is it something like that?
I think it's something like that, but I don't want to be inaccurate, and I don't, the exact criteria are complex. So I don't know exactly like what the full parameters are.
Yeah, well, I mean, having 830 people, you know, almost 1,000 people that you're paying to do nothing, right? I mean, that's a pretty big incentive to try to move some dirt and get them doing something, right? I mean, you're paying them anyway. You may as well have them producing for you. I mean, that's, you know, is there any precedent for that?
So I do want to say, so JC Bankston, one of the workers that I profiled, he really wanted to underscore that workers are not living high on the hog, that the 74% is sort of needed for just basic retention, for covering groceries. He really underscored that for him, it's a pretty significant pay cut because he was working more than 40 hours a week. So, and it's 74% of 40 hours. So he I think wanted to push back against this idea that workers are just doing nothing. But you know, subpay is definitely something. This is not the first time we've seen subpay in a contract. I think what's exciting about this case is that the subpay is coming from a company that has made a stated commitment in the contract to reverse the shuttering of a plant. And so that sort of act of tethering, keeping the company tethered to these workers, I think is a cause for hope among some. And
so, you know, I think it's entirely reasonable for especially workers in, you know, that are affected by this to be optimistic, but cautiously so, right? Because this is the same company that would have, but for the UAW's contract campaign in 2023, left their community to rot. Right. I mean, you know, so they have every reason in the world to be skeptical of this company. What sort of preparations are they making to, you know, to try to make sure that they follow through?
So my understanding is that right now, a big part of it is monitoring and waiting and staying in touch with members and trying to get answers from the company, and trying to sort of track who is going back and when, and be in touch. You know, this is a local that is active. They're still having membership meetings. They run a food pantry out of their local once a month, or they distribute food to needy families once a month in connection with the local food pantry. This is an active local. You know, my sense is that right now, what enforcing this means is sort of staying cohesive and alert. There are probably conversations happening. You know, I can't say I know 100% of the planning and organizing going into this, but I will say that there's a very healthy skepticism that gave me some reassurance that the local really, really wants to be on top of it. And, you know, this is a lifeblood of this town. It's not like people aren't going to notice if Stellantis doesn't follow through.
Right. Right. I think that's very important in making sure that the local stays active, that the communication stays up to date, and that they continue to monitor Stellantis to make sure that they do follow through. And Stellantis has not announced a start date for preparations to begin reopening, have they?
I reached out to Stellantis for the article and asked them for a precise timetable, and all they said was, look, we're complying with the contract, and didn't offer much more than that. I do know, so like there have been some timetables laid out. So the contract says that Stellantis must reopen the Belvidere assembly plant to produce mid-sized trucks by 2027. Although the language does not actually specify how many jobs would be created. And the electric vehicle facility is a few years down the line. I think the parts distribution hub would be a little bit sooner. So we are looking at commitments that are a bit down the line. I mean, you know, we're not talking 10 years, we're talking a few years. Right. But nonetheless, I think it's going to take a lot of really sustained monitoring and organizing, honestly, to sort of make sure things are on track.
The other thing that gave me a lot of hope that we would be able to see this follow through is the fact that the UAW was able to secure a right to strike the whole company over investment decisions and outsourcing, job placements, stuff like that. Was that a discussion as you're talking to these folks about, you know, what are your thoughts about Stellantis' commitment here? Was there any explicit discussion of you know, we're prepared to strike nationwide if they don't follow through with their commitment to this community?
As far as what I came across, that's not the language that people were using right now in this moment. But I do think there's an undercurrent of that threat. I mean, there has to be. You know, workers already showed themselves willing to walk out and participate in a stand-up strike strategy, which was kind of a series of rolling strikes that caught employers by surprise. You know, they were surprise announcements. You didn't know where UAW was going to strike next. And we saw a lot of enthusiasm and excitement around that, and a lot of participation. But, you know, so I think the fact that there's been a strike so recently really makes it so that that contract language is not theoretical and, you know, comes with a real threat.
Right. Is there anything else that you think is important for folks to understand about this situation in Belvidere, or maybe even, you know, broadening out the state of the UAW's relationship with the Big Three and their campaign to organize the non-union sector, and how this plays into it?
Well, there's actually one thing I wanted to highlight about the Belvidere situation, which is that the UAW has framed the commitment to create an electric vehicle plant as part of a just transition. The idea of a just transition is that, you know, in light of the climate crisis, there is a need to transition away from fossil fuels. And a lot of people in labor and also in the climate movement have been pressing that if that's going to happen, we need to make sure that workers are taken care of, that no workers are left behind, that they are put in jobs that are dignified union jobs, and that it does not become a race to the bottom, which I think is a big concern among UAW. When you look at the burgeoning, growing electric vehicle industry in the United States, there's a lot of concern about non-union jobs, about jobs with really poor conditions. And so in a highlighter that summarizes the wins in the Stellantis contract, UAW describes the Belvidere assembly plant as part of a just transition. I think it said something like Belvidere was flat on its back and now it's getting this new facility. And I know that, you know, Shawn Fain, the president of UAW, who won as a reform challenger, has used the language of a just transition. And this has been a real opening with climate activists. So there are groups like the Labor Network for Sustainability that really, really mobilize climate activists to show up for the stand-up strike. And they came to picket lines. They, flyered a gathering of automakers in Detroit. And so we're seeing, some interesting opening of possible collaboration between different sectors of the movement that I think are exciting and interesting. And when you talk about UAW's push to organize the unorganized, you can't really talk about that without talking about the electric vehicle sector, because it's highly ununionized, and there's just a lot of potential for workers to really be in the driver's seat of what a shift away from fossil fuels means for the people doing the labor.
Right. I think that's very important because, as we've been hearing talk about a transition to electric vehicles, it has aroused a skepticism from a lot of folks about, because they have seen the state of the transition so far, right? And so they've got every reason to be skeptical. How is it being received, that language of a just transition and the UAW taking a more active role in the transition to electric vehicles and being more vocal about the need for this, but with the very strong caveat that it needs to be good-paying union jobs? How is that being received by the membership?
I asked that question to Matt Franzen, the president of the local in Belvidere, and he basically said something like, look, workers are not necessarily giddy about the transition to electric vehicles, but they understand that having this plant in their town could really help their town. And JC Bankston, the worker who I interviewed, he was pretty open. And sorry, when I talk about the local, I'm talking about UAW 1268. That's the local in Belvidere. But JC Bankston was if this change is going to happen, let's just make sure that it's not a race to the bottom. I think the broader question of how membership overall feels about electric vehicles is a complex one and would probably take some polling or data that I don't have. I will say that there's been a false narrative put out there by auto companies, actually, that workers and unions are opposed to electric vehicles. And it was actually put out aggressively during the strike, people trying to make the argument that the strike is going to actually hurt the transition to electric vehicles, even though if you listen to what Shawn Fain's administration was saying, that's not at all what they were saying. They didn't say anything in opposition to electric vehicles. It was just purely this argument that we have to prevent a race to the bottom in terms of labor standards.
Right. That's it. I was actually shocked how much I saw that, especially in some of the mainstream, maybe like MSNBC type places. It's
a perfect talking point to try to peel away support among the sort of Biden liberals, people who are invested in climate mitigation and, telling them oh, workers going on strike is going to threaten climate mitigation is the perfect talking point for automakers.
Right.
And I really appreciate that you brought up that there has been some opening in terms of collaboration between environmental justice activists and labor activists and uniting around what a just transition looks like and how that includes good union jobs. And I think the more we collaborate, the more we can dispel that kind of narrative.
Yeah, and I mean, there were plenty of climate activists who were like, all right, this is our moment if we want to build trust and solidarity with unions and let them know that we're for real and that we really are going to fight for the livelihoods and well-being of workers. Now is our chance. There were people who took it really seriously. There were pretty broad coalitions of climate groups who demonstrated solidarity, including going out to picket lines.
Right. All right. Sarah Lazare, editor of Workday Magazine. Really appreciate your time. Check out our work in Workday Magazine and in these times. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, and sorry, could I just say, I want to give credit where it's due. So this Belvidere article, it was a collaboration. It was co-published with Workday Magazine, In These Times, and Labor Notes. So I just want to give shout out to all those other publications too.
Absolutely. I'll completely endorse that. Labor Notes, In These Times, Workday Magazine. Check them all out. Subscribe to all of them if you haven't yet. It's very good. All very good stuff. So make sure that you're following all of their work. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.